Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar, Tips for Targeted Adjustments in Photoshop. This remains easily one of my very favorite subjects to talk about, to teach about. I love Photoshop. Obviously, I've been using Photoshop for a long time, and part of the reason that I love Photoshop is that it's such an incredibly powerful tool. I always tell photographers, if you can imagine something that you want to do to an image, there is a way that you can accomplish that inside of Photoshop. The challenge, of course, is then just figuring out exactly how to go about doing that. And so today we're going to focus on targeted adjustments, and this to me is really all about control over your photos. I'm a control freak. I love being able to exert as much control over my images as possible. Essentially, when I have a vision for what I want to accomplish for a photo, I don't want to be held back. I want to be able to exactly create the effect that I'm trying to create. And many times that involves targeted adjustment. So it involves looking at the image and deciding on specific things that I want to accomplish for that photo, and more importantly, specific areas. So the easy part, almost you might say, is when you apply global adjustments, adjustments that apply to the entire image. But where we really start to get more sophisticated is where we're able to adjust only the highlights or only the shadows or only the sky or only the foreground or some particular object. So today we're going to focus on some tips to help you better understand what targeted adjustments are, the various pieces that relate to targeted adjustments. So let's go ahead and dive right into Photoshop. The first thing I want to do is sort of illustrate a concept related to the use of targeted adjustments. I find that a lot of photographers do not understand what exactly a targeted adjustment is, and they start to get confused, especially when we talk about all of these various features inside of Photoshop. So we have selections and we have marching ants, which is how a lot of people describe the lines that define a selection. And we have saved selections and alpha channels and layer masks and all of these confusing things. They seem very complicated. They're all very simple, though. And in fact, all of those things that I just mentioned are really the exact same thing. So I want to give you an idea here for how you can think about the approach for layer masking targeted adjustments. It's so simple, I think, if you consider that a targeted adjustment, it only involves two pieces. Number one, of course, is the adjustment, but we want that adjustment to be targeted to specific areas of the photo, and so that's where the second component comes in, and that's what we refer to as a layer mask. But I think it's much easier to just think of it as a stencil. So I'm just going to draw a stencil here. I'm going to make a new layer. For the moment, don't worry about exactly what I'm doing. Just try to help understand the concepts a little bit. I'm just going to create a visual stencil. So when I try and trace here on this bald eagle, of course, you'll very quickly start to realize that I'm not very good at drawing inside of the lines. In fact, I'm not very good at drawing anything at all. This is probably part of the reason that I took up photography instead of, say, painting or drawing. But you get the idea that I'm essentially outlining the bird itself here, the bald eagle. I'll use a little bit larger brush, and I'm just painting with white, and all I'm really doing is defining a specific area. I'm essentially telling Photoshop, hey, do you see this portion of the image? That's what I want to work with. Maybe I want to apply an adjustment that only affects the eagle, for example. I'll go ahead and make my work a little bit easier and use a few keyboard shortcuts there to fill in the details for the rest of the image. But essentially, I've created a stencil. This is, for all intents and purposes, a selection or an alpha channel or a saved selection or a layer mask. All of those things, once again, they're just stencils. And so in the context of a targeted adjustment or a layer mask where we're doing something in a very targeted way, what we need to keep in mind is that black blocks and white reveals. So you might think of it again as that stencil where the white area is what's cut out and the black area is what's not cut out. So in other words, if I'm applying a targeted adjustment, then I'm going to say, I want to affect the bird but not the background. So the area that's going to be white or selected or my actual active stencil area, that's the bird. So the area I want to affect, we'll call it white right now. The area I don't want to affect is black. But again, it is a simple stencil. As you'll see a little bit later, when I create a layer mask, it's going to look exactly like this. If I were to save a selection, it would look exactly like this. When you see that animated dashed line, what is often referred to as the marching ants that defines a selection, that is really being thought of by Photoshop as exactly this, a black and white image where white is selected and black is not selected, where white is an adjustment that is affecting the image and black is not being adjusted, where white is visible and black is invisible. It depends on context, but again, all of these various features, they're all really the same thing. It's just a way for Photoshop to identify specific areas of the photo. Yes or no, adjusted or not adjusted, and in our case, that happens to be accomplished with white for adjustments, black for a lack of adjustments. So let's go ahead and just close this image and we'll move on to another conceptual issue. Oh wait, what's this? Yes, I should mention the GreyLearning Everything Bundle. I suspect many of you are already subscribed to the GreyLearning Everything Bundle. We are just wrapping up publication of an additional course on understanding Lightroom. So if you've ever been confused by Lightroom, this course is aimed to help you understand Lightroom better. We have a number of other courses that are in production right now and will be published over the coming weeks. Very excited about a huge amount of content that we're producing. 2016 is looking to be our busiest year ever in terms of content, and you can save $50 off the normal price of the bundle. I'll share this link again at the end of the webinar, but just visit timgray.me/graywebinar and you'll automatically get that discount built in. All right, so there is the image that we want to look at for the next topic here. Now, again, I'm going to show you a little technique, but don't worry about exactly what I'm doing. I promise you that when I am actually producing various effects, when we're actually learning these techniques, I will give you details on how I'm accomplishing it. But for now, I want to underscore a couple of concepts. So we related that concept, that stencil, in terms of how we're thinking about selections and layer masks. Let's talk about subtlety versus accuracy. So this is, I think, an important tip because many photographers I find spend hours and hours and hours, maybe not literally, but sometimes literally, hours creating a selection, a targeted adjustment, and fine-tuning their layer mask for an incredibly subtle adjustment where the accuracy was not all that important. So let me show you what I mean. Again, don't worry about exactly what I'm doing here. I will show you these various techniques in a moment. But I've, in this case, created a selection and I'm going to apply an adjustment to that selected area. Well, you can imagine, since the selection took me all of half a second to create, that it's probably not the most accurate selection in the world. Well, that might be okay and it might be a problem. Let's go ahead and zoom in and we see that obviously my selection was of very poor quality. The accuracy level was very low. Now, how would we describe the subtlety of my adjustment? Well, at the moment, my adjustment is far from subtle. Well, these two have a relationship. If my adjustment is going to be subtle, then my layer mask accuracy can be relatively low, all things considered. In other words, if I just want to apply a very slight darkening of the sky, I don't need to spend considerable time making sure that my layer mask is absolutely perfect because I'm never going to see the evidence of that. So I'll turn off the adjustment and back on again. This layer mask was highly inaccurate, but because my adjustment is relatively subtle, that's no problem at all. So bear in mind that in some cases, when you're just applying a very subtle change to an area of the image, you don't have to spend hours and hours fine-tuning a selection or a layer mask in order to produce a good result. Obviously, I'm a control freak. I'm very particular. I want to make sure that everything is absolutely perfect all the time, but sometimes I have to cut myself a little bit of slack and realize I'm just applying a very subtle adjustment. I'm opening up some shadow detail. I don't need a mask, a layer mask, with absolute perfect precision. So just bear that in mind, and especially as you're just learning some of the various techniques and trying to get a better sense of how to use layer masking in your own workflow, practice with some relatively subtle effects. Now, of course, for educational purposes, I'm not going to be applying very many subtle effects because I want it to be very clear to you. I want you to be able to see very easily exactly where I'm working. As a result, some of the adjustments might even be a little bit comical, but the point is that if your adjustment is relatively subtle, you don't need a highly accurate mask. All right, so now that we have some basic concepts underway, let's take a look at how we might actually work. When it comes to those relatively subtle adjustments, the process is really very simple. And I'll show you the approach that I take. I think it's a helpful, useful approach. You could put a couple of variations on this, but let's assume in this case that I want to apply some adjustments to the sky, maybe just darken or add a little bit of contrast. The easiest way in many cases, especially when it's a subtle adjustment where we don't need precision in terms of the edge of that mask, is to just paint the effect into the image. Literally to just paint into the image wherever I want the adjustment. So let me show you the workflow that I typically use for that. Again, for most of my adjustments, I'm going to apply a relatively strong effect just so that it's easier for you to see here exactly what I'm doing. But all of this, remember, there are two pieces with a targeted adjustment. There's the adjustment and there's the targeted. So the adjustment is the adjustment layer, and then the targeted part is the layer mask. Well, when I add an adjustment layer, so I'm going to click on the Add Adjustment Layer button, the half black, half white circle icon down at the bottom of the Layers panel. And for my purposes, just because it's easy to apply a very strong adjustment quickly so that you can see what's going on, I'm going to use a curves adjustment, but this could be any type of adjustment layer that I would like. Maybe I want to increase saturation in certain areas or shift the color balance, whatever it might be, but I'm just going to go ahead and use curves. And for our purposes, I'll apply an exaggerated adjustment. Now, this is how I start with any targeted adjustment, is to apply a very exaggerated adjustment, and you can see that it's affecting the entire image. The reason I'm applying an exaggerated adjustment is because I want to be able to see very clearly where I'm affecting the image, so then I can fine-tune that location and then come back to the layer mask, to the adjustment layer, and fine-tune my overall adjustment. Of course, I also like to paint the effect into the image. You might already have a clue, maybe you're already a little bit familiar with layer masking, but we can define a layer mask, just like that stencil that we saw with the bald eagle image, where white areas of the layer mask represent areas of the image that are being adjusted, and black areas represent areas that are not being adjusted. And so I can define that right here, right now. Well, that means I could paint black into this image. My personal preference, though, is to start with a black layer mask. So once I've applied this strong adjustment so I can see the effect very clearly in the image, now I want to fill in this layer mask with black. So you notice that an adjustment layer comes with a layer mask automatically. Every time you add an adjustment layer in Photoshop, you'll get a layer mask, and that layer mask will be all white. In other words, it's an all white stencil so that the image is being affected in its entirety. I want to start with the opposite. Well, this is a really, I think, helpful lesson, a good little tidbit to be aware of. A layer mask is just an image. Yes, it's an image being used in a very special way, but it is just an image, a black and white image or a grayscale image, but an image nevertheless. And so any of the tools that I can use to modify an image, I can also use to modify a layer mask. So for example, I want this layer mask to be black or blocking the effect rather than white for revealing the effect. Well, that's just the opposite. And so, for example, I can go to the Image menu and choose Adjustments, followed by Invert, and that will invert the layer mask. The opposite of white is black, and so choosing that command, or the keyboard shortcut, of course, Control-I on Windows, Command-I on Macintosh, that layer mask is now filled with black. The adjustment is no longer visible. Well, now, if I go grab my brush tool from the toolbox, I'll make sure that I'm using a soft-edged brush, so the hardness setting up on the options bar is at 0%. I want all my other settings just at their default, so normal blend mode, 100% opacity. And then I can adjust my brush size using the left and right square bracket keys, so left square bracket to reduce the brush size, right square bracket to increase the brush size. And then I want to adjust my colors. Down at the bottom of the toolbox, you can see that my colors are currently set to black and white. I'm going to press the letter D on the keyboard. That means default colors. With an image layer, the defaults are black and white. But with a layer mask, those defaults are white and black. But I don't need to worry about which is which. I can just press the letter X on the keyboard to exchange those foreground and background colors at any time. Right now, I have a layer mask that's filled with black, and so I need to paint with white. The adjustment is being blocked. I want to reveal it in certain areas, so I simply paint with white, and so you can see that that adjustment is coming into the image. I am literally painting that adjustment into the image. As soon as I release my mouse, you'll be able to see on that thumbnail for my layer mask Now we have roughly about the top third, we'll call it, maybe a little bit closer to half of the image is white. So the top portion of the image is white, the bottom portion of the image is black on that layer mask. So the adjustment is visible up top, but it is not visible down below. Well, of course, assuming that I did a good job of painting, in this case, I can already see that I have a few areas that were a little bit less than perfect. I overlapped a little bit, no problem at all, though. I can press the X key to exchange or swap the foreground and background colors, and then come paint with black on the hill here if I want to essentially erase the adjustment or block the adjustment. And if I make a mistake in that direction, I can press X again and then just come back and paint. Obviously, in some cases, I could just undo the adjustment as well. But I think you get the idea. We're able to paint with black to block the adjustment and white to reveal the adjustment, and I can always then come back and change that adjustment later. So maybe I wanted some more contrast, make that sky a little bit more dramatic, whatever the case might be. I can go back and forth between my adjustment and my layer mask so that I'm controlling how I'm affecting the image as well as where I'm affecting the image, and I'm doing all of that non-destructively. So I can go back and forth, and as long as I save all of these adjustments, in other words, save a layered document, a Photoshop document or a TIFF image with layers intact, I can always open this image again later and get back to work fine-tuning my layer mask and my adjustment. All right, so we'll go ahead and close that image. And I want to show you some techniques for actually evaluating the results of your targeted adjustments. So just for sake of, well, I guess entertainment really, let's go ahead and apply a relatively subtle adjustment, but we'll assume that I only want this adjustment to affect the water in the foreground. And so once again, that same basic workflow that I like to use when I'm applying a targeted adjustment, start with an exaggerated adjustment so it's easier to see exactly what I'm doing in terms of focusing my adjustment on specific areas. And then I like to invert that layer mask. So again, we could go to the image menu and choose adjustments followed by invert, or with that layer mask active, I can just press Control-I on Windows or Command-I on Macintosh. So now my layer mask is filled with black. I don't see the adjustment at all for this image, but I can very easily paint that adjustment into the image. So again, with my brush tool, make sure my foreground color is set to white, and I can paint my, in this case, I guess you might say slightly extreme saturation adjustment into the image. And I'm being very careful, of course, to only paint in the water area because I just wanted to increase the saturation for the water, at least hypothetically. But now I also want to make sure that I did a really, really good job because you're all watching. This is being recorded. I need to make sure that I'm not going to embarrass myself with a bad targeted adjustment, even though this is a very bad, severe increase in saturation. But let's take a look then at how we can evaluate the mask. Now, in this case, with a very exaggerated adjustment and with me having done an especially poor job of painting that adjustment into the image, it's probably already extremely obvious to you that I have not done a very good job. But in many cases, it won't be so obvious. You won't be able to see the areas that you missed. Right now, you could probably see there are some areas in the water that obviously don't look very saturated compared to areas that do look saturated. And quite frankly, if you look at the thumbnail for the layer mask, you can see that it's pretty spotty at best. But let's pretend like we didn't notice that just yet, and we'll take a look at a few ways that we can evaluate the quality of our layer mask and the adjustment as well. The first thing I like to do is just turn off the visibility for the adjustment. So I can click the eyeball icon to the left of my adjustment layer and turn that adjustment on and off and on and off. And what's happening is I'm seeing the adjustment appear and then disappear. And as a result, it starts to become a little bit more obvious when we have some areas that I missed as far as that layer mask. So that all by itself can be very helpful. A variation on that theme is to disable the layer mask itself and then re-enable it. So if I hold the Shift key on the keyboard and click on the thumbnail for the layer mask, I'll disable the layer mask, essentially making it as though that layer mask was filled with white. In other words, now the adjustment is affecting the entirety of the image, and if I once again hold the Shift key and click on that layer mask thumbnail, then I see the adjustment, the layer mask enabled, so the adjustment is only affecting the area defined by the layer mask. So I see the adjustment in the entire image, then only based on the layer mask, and once again that can help to show me some areas that were less than perfect. In addition, I can look at the actual layer mask itself. If I hold the Alt key on Windows or the Option key on Macintosh and click on the layer mask thumbnail, now I get a full resolution view of that actual layer mask. Now I can see just how bad a layer mask it really is, but more importantly is I can work right here in fine-tuning that layer mask. Now, of course, with this view, I don't know where the edge of the shoreline is, where the water ends and the land begins, and so I can't very well paint along that top line, but I can certainly clean up everything else. So generally, I would want to come into the image and make sure that I've painted a good line all the way along the edge of the area that I want to affect. Make sure that I have a good result there, then come into that layer mask view, again by Alt or Option clicking on the thumbnail for the layer mask. Now I feel pretty confident that that top line, the transition from white to black, is pretty good, and I can just fill in the details by painting everywhere else. And with this view, even if I miss just a little sliver of an area, I don't know how well you can see some of these areas, but even if I missed a pretty small area, it'll stand out pretty well. And so I can do a good job of making sure that everything is nice and clean on that layer mask. And then once again, Alt or Option click on the thumbnail for the layer mask, and everything is good. So now I know I have a nice clean layer mask. Obviously I can come back to the adjustment, so I can go to the layer mask by clicking on the thumbnail for the layer mask, or to the adjustment itself by clicking on the thumbnail for the adjustment layer, and then go back and fine tune. So in this case, maybe, tone down that saturation increase just a little bit, for example. All right, moving right along. Let's take a look at a variation on that, and that is shades of gray. So we've been talking about black and white. You might have noticed, looking at the layer mask for that previous image, that there were also some shades of gray because I was painting with a soft brush. And so there was a little bit of a transition from one area to the next. Let's take a look at how we can take even more control over that process. Very straightforward. I'll just go ahead and apply an adjustment that's going to brighten up. Let's say I want to open up the shadow detail just a little bit. I'm going to apply a little bit of an exaggerated adjustment that's affecting the entire image. And then once again, I'll invert that layer mask. So Control-I on Windows, Command-I on Macintosh. Now the adjustment affects nothing. This is all repetition, right? We've already done this same basic thing with a couple of images, and I can paint into the shadow areas in order to really open up that shadow detail within the image. So now I'm able to open up detail in those shadows, for example. Well, that's a full effect. So looking at that layer mask, remember, black blocks, white reveals. So the areas of black on my stencil here, my layer mask, those areas are not being affected by my adjustment, and the areas that are white are being affected by my adjustment. But what if I want a partial effect? So coming back to the image, I've opened up shadow detail somewhat significantly in some of these areas. What if I want to lighten up this area in the middle of the image, but just a little bit, not as much? Well, black blocks, white reveals. We can also use shades of gray in between. And this is actually pretty cool because we're able to define the percentage of effect that we want. So we could joke about, we want 37.4% of the effect or 58.6% of the effect. No, of course, I'm never going to be that precise. Usually I'll break it down into 20% increments or even 25% increments. So maybe I want a quarter of the effect, half the effect, or 3/4 of the effect, but I'll express that as a percentage. So the areas that are black are getting 0% of the effect. Well, black is 0% of white. And the areas where I painted white are getting 100% of the effect because white is 100% of white. That's actually just a brightness value. So let's click on the foreground color swatch. That will bring up our color picker. The current color is white, and you'll see that my brightness value, that's the B in HSB, is set to 100%. So if I paint with 0% brightness, I'm blocking the effect because I'm painting with black. If I paint with 100% brightness, I'm getting 100% of the adjustment effect because I'm painting with white. If I want half of it, I could just dial in 50%. So I'll dial in a brightness value for that HSB setting, 50% in this case if I want 50% or half of the effect. I'll click OK. You can see that my foreground color is set to that middle gray. And now if I paint in any area of the image, I'm getting half the effect. So I can choose my brightness value. So black for 0% brightness or 0% of the effect, white for 100% brightness or 100% of the effect, and I can dial in any value in between. So again, I don't usually need to get down to the 1% increments here, but just to take a quarter of the adjustment, so 25%, or half of the adjustment, 50%, 3/4 at 75%, something like that. Again, the point being is that I can use those shades of gray to exercise greater control. Little side note, a lot of photographers, when they see this concept, they'll go back into the opacity setting, and instead of changing their foreground and background colors, they'll leave those set to black and white and reduce the opacity. So for example, I can set my opacity level to 50% and paint with white on black, and I get the exact same value. I do not recommend this, because now when you go to paint again, you'll get the exact same value unless you overlap with a previous area that you've painted on. And so you get a little bit of a variation in tonal values in terms of that layer mask that can be a little bit unpredictable in terms of the result that you're getting. And so instead, I recommend leaving that opacity setting at 100% and then changing the color. So again, if we're using a 50% adjustment, 50% brightness value, now I can paint very consistently over that single area, getting the same result constantly. Now, then the question, of course, I know that a lot of photographers, and I see somebody has posted in the questions, is can they use the adjustment brush in Lightroom to accomplish the exact same thing? Yes, sort of, but without the degree of control that we have inside of Photoshop. So you'll see some more examples of that as we move forward here today. So Lightroom does have an adjustment brush and a graduated filter and a radial filter that allow us to apply some targeted adjustments. We're a little more limited in terms of which adjustments we can apply, but we're also limited. We don't have selections in Lightroom, for example. We don't have as much ability to fine-tune that mask, and so we just have a lot more control inside of Photoshop. All right, let's move on to our next image. So so far I've been painting my adjustments into the image. I mentioned that with Photoshop, one of our advantages is the ability to use selections as the basis of a targeted adjustment. Let's take a look at exactly how that works. Very simple. First off, a little trick here. Very often I find that photographers struggle to create a selection of the area they want to adjust. Let's assume here that I want to create a selection of the rocks in the foreground. It's not so difficult, but it's a lot easier to create a selection of the sky. I'm going to use the Quick Selection tool. This is my go-to tool for creating selections because I'm lazy and the Quick Selection tool is quick and I want something quick and easy. So with the sky, the opposite of what I want to select, I can adjust my brush size, but really just drag across the sky a little bit, and there you have it, a selection of the sky. Let's take a look at what that would look like for the rocks. I'll press Control D or Command D to deselect and then start over. And now you see, in order to get a selection of the rocks, I've got to paint around a pretty significant area of the image. I mean, granted, it's still pretty easy, but it's not quite as quick. And so, handy little tip, very often it's easier to create a selection of what you don't want than of what you do want. So once again, the sky, just slide. Oh, now it let me down. I need to drag a little further. There you have it. So just a little arc of painting with the mouse, and we have a selection for the sky. That's not what I wanted. It's the opposite of what I wanted. But keep in mind, I can always invert the layer mask later. We already saw how to do that. Or I can invert the selection before I've used it as the basis of a layer mask for a targeted adjustment. So select inverse, and we have the selection that we wanted. Now, of course, I've created a selection. Now I want to convert that into a stencil, but wait, we already know that a stencil is exactly the same thing, whether it's a selection, whether it's an alpha channel, a saved selection, a layer mask. All of these things are really the exact same thing. It's just how they're presented and how we access them. A selection is essentially the exact same thing as a layer mask, just in a different context. So how do I convert the selection to a layer mask? It's easy. I just create an adjustment layer. Remember, adjustment layers come with a layer mask automatically. By default, that adjustment layer will have a layer mask that is filled with white, meaning the adjustment will affect the entire image. However, we can also create a layer mask based on a selection by simply having a selection active when we add our adjustment layer. So here's my selection. I'll go ahead and add an adjustment layer. We'll just stick with our theme here and use curves. And when I add that curves adjustment layer, my adjustment is only affecting that selected area. So you can see that my layer mask attached to that curves adjustment layer is in the shape of the stencil, the selection that I drew, and so I can then apply my adjustment. Maybe I wanted some more contrast for the rocks or whatever the case might be. But by simply creating a selection and then adding an adjustment layer, my layer mask will be based on the selection. So we've seen here the quick selection tool. That's my go-to tool. I could do an entire webinar. In fact, I could do an entire video course just on selections. And I promise at some point in the near future, we will have a webinar specific to selections. Today, I'm just going to show you a few of my favorite techniques for creating selections. But the quick selection tool is, generally speaking, the place where I start. We'll see the magic wand tool here shortly as well. I'll go ahead and close this image. Now, I created a selection, but I did not feather the selection. And the reason for that is that I never feather selections, except when I want to show you why I never feather selections. But I don't feather selections because I don't really know what value to use. So if I were to create a selection here, I'll zoom out just a little bit. I'm going to just create a very basic, simple selection. I'll assume I want to add some contrast or reduce haze in that background area. Well, if I were to apply an adjustment here, you can see that the transition between the area that was selected and the rest of the image is very, very harsh. I'll go ahead and zoom in and we can see that we literally transition from adjusted to not adjusted in 1 pixel. That's not very good. So conceptually, I should have feathered my selection. I'm going to throw away that adjustment for the moment, and we'll start off with that selection once again. I should, in theory, have feathered that selection. So let's go to the select menu and then we'll choose the modify option followed by feather. And now we have to specify in pixels how many pixels to feather that selection by. I have no idea. I mean, I have an idea, but not really. It depends on the resolution of the image. It depends on the transition within the area of the image that I'm trying to adjust. In this case, I think maybe 10, 15 pixels, but this is also a pretty low resolution image that I'm using just for demonstration purposes, so maybe 5 is fine. I don't really know. And I don't want to guess, and I don't want to go back and forth multiple times trying to, by trial and error, find the right value. So instead, I never feather selections. Instead, I feather the layer mask after the fact, which gives me the exact same result, but it enables me to see an actual preview of the effect while I'm working. So instead of feathering the selection, I'll go ahead and just create my adjustment. I'll make that an exaggerated adjustment just as we saw before, but now I'm able to work with a layer mask, feathering the mask rather than the selection, and so I'm able to see the actual effect in real time, no guessing involved. So I'm going to go ahead and click in the properties panel. Right now I'm working on my curves adjustment. I'm going to switch to the layer mask option, that masks setting, and then you can see I have a feather setting. I'll go ahead and increase that value for feather, and I'll just keep going until, right about there looks to be enough. That's 18.8 pixels. Well, I had guessed 15, I think was my initial guess, 15 or 20. Maybe it was 5 because it's low res. In this case, somewhere closer to 20 pixels was a good value, but I don't want to guess. I just want to see the actual effect while I'm working. So I don't feather my selections. Instead, I feather my layer masks after the fact. It gives me much, much more flexibility. I saw there was a question, by the way. Somebody was wondering about why I'm working on JPEG images rather than RAW or TIFF images, and it's very simple. For demonstration purposes on a webinar, it's much easier and safer for me to work with low resolution images with relatively small file sizes. Under normal circumstances, I absolutely would be working with my master images. For me personally, that means working with my raw captures in Lightroom, and then when I want to take advantage of the power of Photoshop, I'll send that image over to Photoshop, at which point a PSD file or a TIFF file will be created based on the settings that you've got established in preferences inside of Lightroom. So yes, these are just for demonstration purposes. So much like my adjustments here are a little bit wild and crazy, so too my workflow, I would not be working with JPEG images typically. So I want to talk to you a little bit about luminosity masks. This is a topic that comes up on a pretty regular basis. Luminosity masks are interesting, but to me they're not super powerful. We have already the ability to fine-tune an adjustment like curves based on highlight or shadow areas. Camera Raw and Lightroom have some pretty sophisticated abilities there, but a lot of photographers get excited about luminosity masks. Just to give you a very rough sense, if I go into the Channels panel and hold the Control key on Windows or the Command key on Macintosh and click on the RGB thumbnail, the RGB channel there, I get a selection for the bright areas of the image. I could then go and use that adjustment, that layer mask, sorry, the selection, as the basis of a layer mask for my adjustment. And so if I add a curves adjustment, for example, first let me show you what that mask looks like. It's focused on the bright areas rather than the dark areas. And it's automatically feathered because it is a grayscale image that reflects the tones within the photo. So that's all well and good. If I go back to my adjustment, I can work on the bright areas of the photo. There are various techniques where I can adjust that mask, that luminosity mask, for just the really, really bright areas, etc. But I want to show you a little technique that I'll use in situations where I want to focus my adjustment on the brightest or the darkest areas. We'll go ahead and just open up shadow detail here in this case as our example. And that process involves using the threshold command to define a split between the dark and the bright areas of the photo. I'm going to start off by making a copy of my background image layer. So I'll just drag that image layer down to the Create New Layer button, the blank sheet of paper icon at the bottom of the Layers panel. I'm going to set my opacity for that layer to 50%. Now that is going to do absolutely nothing at the moment, but once we apply the threshold command, you'll see that that's much more helpful. Speaking of that threshold command, let's go ahead and apply it. I'll go to the image menu and then choose Adjustments followed by Threshold. That will bring up a threshold dialog. We're able to choose the split between black and white. What we're creating here is literally a black and white image. Every pixel will be either black or white. No shades of gray, just literally black or white. But we can choose at what tonal value we want to have that split occur. And so I can drag over to the right so that, as you see in the thumbnail, and you can kind of see that overlay, because I reduced the opacity, now I'm seeing a black and white overlay on top of my image, and I can use that to evaluate my result, to figure out where exactly I want to define that split in terms of tonal value. So if I'm focused primarily on the shadows, I might do something like this, for example. So define that threshold level based on a review of the image. I'll go ahead and click OK. And now I'm going to bring the opacity setting back up to 100%. So here is my adjustment, my layer mask. Well, not yet, but it's going to be a layer mask, which is defined based on the darkest areas versus the brightest areas of the photo. So I'm going to create a selection, and I'll use the magic wand tool here. I'll show you some more about the magic wand shortly, but I can just click, for example, in a white area to define a selection for the whites, or I can click in a black area to define a selection for the blacks. So essentially the highlights versus the shadows. I can then turn off the visibility for my background copy layer. I could even throw it away altogether at this point because I probably don't need it anymore. But then I can add an adjustment layer once again. You'll notice that the adjustment layer now reflects that selection. So I'm working with the dark areas or the relatively dark areas of the photo. And so I can apply an adjustment that will fine tune just those darkest areas. So there's certainly more involved in terms of the potential of using luminosity masks. They can be very helpful in certain situations, but I find that I don't tend to use them all that often because there are a variety of other techniques that I can use to define specific areas for that layer mask. And I see there was a question about elements, Photoshop Elements. Essentially, can we do all of these same things inside of Photoshop Elements? And the answer is, for most of this, yes, we can feather layer masks in Elements. The specific techniques are a little bit different in Photoshop Elements, but the concepts are essentially the same. And yes, I think I addressed this previously, but a question about if I save as a TIFF, and the same thing would go for a Photoshop PSD document, will my layers be preserved? Yes, by default, all those layers will be preserved, your adjustment layers, your saved selections, your layer masks, etc., so that you can reopen and continue where you left off. So again, tremendous flexibility when you're working in this way. So with the previous image, well, 2 images ago with the paraglider, we saw the feathering of that selection. Well, you might have noticed that the result was a gradient. So just really quickly, I want to show you that we can actually just create a gradient. So if we're working in Lightroom, we have the graduated filter. If we create a rectangular selection and feather it, we effectively have a gradient. But let's take a look at the actual gradient tool. So I've added an adjustment. I've applied a little bit of an exaggerated adjustment. Now I'm going to choose my gradient tool, which allows me to draw a gradient, of course. I'm going to go up onto the options bar and I will click the pop-up and choose the very first option, which at the moment looks like gray to black. In actual fact, that first preset option for the gradient tool is actually the foreground color to background color gradient. You'll notice that right now my foreground color is set to middle gray and the background is set to black. If I press the letter D on the keyboard to get those default colors of white and black, then I get a white to black gradient, which is exactly what I want. I also want to make sure that the first option of these 5 shapes, if you will, for the gradient is set to the linear gradient. That first option, the linear gradient or the straight line gradient. Normal blend mode, 100% opacity, dithering is fine. All the default settings by and large are perfectly fine. And then I'm going to turn on the preview of that layer mask. So again, holding the Alt or Option key and clicking on the thumbnail for the layer mask, and then I'll simply click and drag in the image to draw a gradient. If you've ever used a graduated split neutral density filter, this looks, I'm sure, very familiar. I can choose exactly where I want the gradient to appear based on where I click and drag. So where I initially click and then where I release defines the transition for that gradient, the starting and ending point, and the direction that I drag determines the direction of the gradient. So I'll go ahead and go back to the image here, and you'll see my thumbnail updating, but also the appearance of the adjustment updating. I can choose the direction and the distance of that transition based on my own preference, based on the shapes within the image, based in part on the strength of my adjustment. But you can see that we can define that gradient just by using the gradient tool. And again, any of the tools in Photoshop that allow you to work directly with pixels in your image can also be used to work with your layer mask. So there's all sorts of possible tricks here in terms of being able to apply various effects using a layer mask. And I said there was a question about, do I recommend using the curves adjustment most often? Well, sort of. It is one of my favorite adjustments because it gives us a lot of power and control for both tonal and color adjustments. It's not the exclusive one, quite frankly. In a presentation like this, it's just the easiest for creating a very strong effect very quickly. That makes it a little bit easier for everyone to see exactly what we're doing. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close that image. And now we're going to take a look at a technique for fine-tuning our layer masks and also being able to create selections in a slightly different way. So I showed you the quick selection tool. I also want to talk about the magic wand tool, which is essentially a variation on a theme. You might say that the quick selection tool is something like a version 2.0 of the magic wand tool. It's an oversimplification and perhaps doesn't give enough credit to the quick selection tool, but they're both similar in that they are sampling the image. And so with the quick selection tool, I'll go ahead and choose that tool, I can click and drag across the image and I'm essentially sampling. I'm saying, hey Photoshop, take a look at these pixels. Can you make a selection of similar stuff? Well, it does a pretty good job, all things considered, but it's not so great when we have a lot of discontiguous areas. You can see that I have a few little nooks, little areas that are not included in the selection because they're physically separated, you might say. The bird and the branch are creating this little island of sky, so I would need to come into that area and add it manually. I've got this little tiny area down here, I would have to add that manually, and that can be a little bit challenging. The magic wand tool makes that process pretty easy. So if I click and hold my mouse over the quick selection tool button, I'll get a flyout menu where I can choose the magic wand tool. Once again, the magic wand tool is a sampling tool, meaning I can click on an area and create a selection based on the color value for the pixel that I clicked on. However, the magic wand tool is better in some respects. I would give full credit to the quick selection tool for being incredibly sophisticated, but we also have, with the magic wand tool, the ability to turn off the contiguous option. So by default, contiguous is turned on. I create a selection of the sky, and I'm still missing those other areas. I'll go ahead and deselect. If I turn off the contiguous checkbox, click once again, and now I have a selection that includes all of those little pockets of sky. So that is a considerable advantage in some cases when it comes to creating a selection. Now, the really big goal I find for many photographers working with the magic wand tool is to try to find settings that will enable them to create a selection with one click. The problem is it takes them about 50,000 trial and error clicks before they find all those right settings. So I recommend a little bit of a different approach. I usually start with a relatively low value for tolerance. I'm going to start with a value that's a little bit too low. I usually want contiguous turned off. My sample size I'll usually set to a 5x5 average so that if I accidentally clicked on some little errant pixel, that's not going to influence the result. So I'm averaging 25 pixels in a little block. So with that option selected, with contiguous turned off, I click, and you can see that I get a selection that includes those discontiguous areas, but I didn't quite get the entire sky selected. Conceptually, that means I need a higher value for tolerance. So maybe I take that up to 16, deselect, click on the sky again. That's pretty close, but you see I'm still missing some areas, for example, at the top left corner. That might cause you to assume that we need to increase the value for tolerance more. But I actually recommend once you've found a setting that gets you pretty close, and I actually find that 16 works really well for most situations where I'm using the magic wand tool. In other words, if the situation is well suited to the magic wand tool, a value of 16 for tolerance is probably a very good starting point. And so I'll, instead of increasing that value and starting over, so instead of deselecting, which, by the way, I can certainly do from the menu by choosing Select, Deselect, but I prefer keyboard shortcuts to speed up my workflow a little bit. So just a quick Control-D on Windows or Command-D on Macintosh. So I'll go ahead and deselect, and now I'll click into the image. That wasn't quite enough, so I can Shift-click into other areas of the photo to add to my selection. So again, let me start from scratch here. I click in the sky. I've got most of the sky. I can shift-click somewhere else to add to that selection. Now you might assume I need to click inside the area that didn't get selected. Not true. I actually just needed to click on a pixel that will be pretty close. So if I hold the Shift key and click up around here, that's probably a close enough match to those pixels up in the corner that they'll also be added. So you don't necessarily need to be quite as precise as you would otherwise assume. This is looking pretty good. I think we've got a good starting point. You might notice I have a little pixel right here on the bird's wing. We'll go ahead and zoom in. A little spot. So in theory, that means my setting for tolerance was a little bit too high. It is important to be careful when you're working with the magic wand tool that you don't accidentally include additional areas that you didn't intend to. But let's just assume that's fine for now. I can always clean that up on my layer mask, of course, as we've already seen. I'll go ahead and apply an adjustment. Yes, again, I'm going to use curves just because it's easy to create a nice exaggerated adjustment very quickly. If I zoom in on the feather of the bird, here is that spot that had been selected. No problem. I'll just go to my layer mask, choose my brush tool, reduce that brush size, in this case rather significantly, set that foreground color to black to block, and I can erase that adjustment essentially, block the adjustment in that specific area. Of course, the problem is now I've zoomed in, and so now I can see that this selection edge was not very good. Well, actually, the selection might have been pretty good. I just need to, no pun intended, feather my selection. Well, I don't feather selections, so I didn't feather my selection, but now I need to feather my layer mask. So we'll go to that layer mask, and again on the masks panel you can see that we have the option to feather, to blend a little bit. Oh, now we're starting to see a little bit of a halo. Maybe that means I feathered too much, but I'm not sure it's necessarily too much. I think right about there is a good value, in this case about 3 pixels. It's just not positioned exactly where I want it. So I'm going to take that feathering back down to 0, And instead, when I have a situation like this where I know it's going to be a little bit challenging, I will always go to the mask edge option. I'll bring that dialog out of the way a little bit, and I like to use the on layers preview option. So under the view, I'll use on layers so that I can actually see the effect while I'm working. Here again, I have the feather option, so I'll get the exact same results. I'm going to make this a little too high, just so you can see a little bit more of that halo effect. We can also shift that edge. So I can shift the edge inward or outward, so I can move the adjustment into the bird more or away from the bird more. And if I can find just the right value for both the feathering and that shift edge, I should be able to produce a good transition so that I've got a nice soft transition between the area being adjusted versus not adjusted. Of course, that seems all perfectly fine unless you make the mistake of zooming in on the feather detail here. And you can see we now have a not very good result there. Certainly I could continue working with that feathering, maybe reduce the feathering just a little bit and shift it inward just a little bit. In this case, there's actually a little bit of a bright glow around the bird in any event, but I want to clean this area up. Well, notice that I have a brush. Automatically, when I'm working in Refine Mask, there is a brush available, and that's because we have a little tool here called the Refine Radius tool. We can also erase our refinements. Well, I can just simply paint over this area of the image. I'm essentially saying, hey, Photoshop, can you kind of clean this up a little bit, smooth it out a little bit? And there you have it. It blends that area in to give me a much better transition. Now that's looking pretty good, I gotta say. I'm gonna go ahead and click OK to close the dialog. But bear in mind, this is a ridiculously strong adjustment. This is not even a tiny bit subtle. And so I'm going to really be picking apart the quality of that mask when the adjustment is way too strong. If I wanted to darken the sky, maybe I would take it down to about, I don't know, there roughly. And if I turn that adjustment off, that's a pretty strong adjustment to the sky, but now we have a nice, smooth, and high quality transition between the area we were adjusting and the area that we weren't. So that refine mask option is just incredibly valuable, I find, especially for the fuzzy stuff. Hair, feathers, fur, those types of scenarios, it can be tremendously valuable. Now I want to show you a couple of other things that relate to how I actually work with my images. And first and foremost, so far we've been looking at adjustments and layer masks, and that's all well and good, very powerful stuff. But generally speaking, I find that when I want to apply an adjustment to a specific area of the photo, I usually want to apply more than one adjustment. And so what I like to do is apply those adjustments and then use a layer mask, a single layer mask, to constrain the visibility of all of the adjustments. So just a real quick example here. Yes, of course, I'm going to start with curves because that's my theme for the day. Maybe I want to add some contrast for the sky, but I also want to add some saturation for the sky, and maybe I want to shift the color balance for the sky. Maybe I'll just shift things a little more. Let's make it a little more bluish, and let's get some of that magenta out of there and maybe take it towards sand. Again, obviously a little bit exaggerated in terms of the adjustments, but I'm affecting the entirety of the image. You can see that I have 3 individual adjustment layers, 3 individual layer masks. So now when I decide that, for example, maybe I want to use a gradient to constrain the visibility of these adjustments to just the sky, I would have to create the exact same gradient 3 times. Well, I'm lazy and I don't want to make a gradient 3 times. Also, later, if I decide that my layer mask wasn't quite perfect, I don't want to have to fix it 3 times. So instead, I want one layer mask for multiple adjustments, and that calls for the creation of a layer group. Now I can add a layer group just by clicking on the folder icon down here at the bottom of the layers panel. I could then drag and drop these adjustment layers into the layer group. But there's actually an easier way. I'm going to click on the thumbnail for the first adjustment layer, hold the Shift key, and click on the last thumbnail for the last adjustment layer. So I have all 3 adjustment layers selected. Then I'm going to go up to the panel pop-up menu. So I'm on my layers panel, and at the top right I have that little menu button. If I click on that button, you'll see a pop-up, and there's an option for New Group from Layers. I'll go ahead and choose that option. What are we going to call this? I'll call it sky adjustment, for example, and I'll go ahead and click OK to create that layer group. And all three of those adjustment layers have been placed inside the layer group. So I'll go ahead and enlarge, oops, I didn't want that yet. I'll go ahead and enlarge my panel here so that you can see all of those layers. So we have my original background image layer, my three adjustment layers. Notice that all three adjustments are below my layer group, and they're also indented. Their thumbnail is over toward the right a little bit. That's one indication that they are inside that layer group, and I can expand or collapse. So that can be handy for organizational purposes, but more importantly, we can add a layer mask to our layer group. And so with that layer group active, I'll click on the Add Layer Mask button, the circle inside of a square icon, and then I'll go to my gradient. Just as we saw before, I'm going to use a foreground to background gradient. All the same settings. It's all exactly what we saw previously. So I'll draw a gradient. You can see the gradient for the layer mask icon, and you can see the change in the image. So I'll go ahead and just draw some random gradients here, and you can see that we're able to define that gradient. And because the gradient layer mask is attached to a layer group, everything inside of that layer group is constrained based on that layer mask. So in this case, three adjustments are only affecting the sky and not the rest of the image, and of course they're transitioning in a gradient fashion. So that's the approach I usually take when I want to apply a targeted adjustment, because it makes it so much more flexible. It saves me some work. If I find that I need to change that gradient, for example, I can just go in and change the gradient. I don't need to change it multiple times. I have one mask for multiple adjustments. Well, let's take that a step further, and we're going to apply an adjustment, multiple adjustments, but with multiple masks. So the basic process, very simple. We're really just adding one little piece here. I'm going to go ahead and create a selection with the magic wand tool. So once again, just clicking into the sky and then holding the shift key and clicking in additional areas, and I have the contiguous option turned off. So at least in theory, this should be a reasonably good selection. We won't worry about how accurate it is right now. Let's just assume that this is a great selection, because I don't want to spend time trying to clean it up. I'd rather show you this kind of cool technique. So I have a selection of the sky. Let's go ahead and make a layer group. We'll call that, I'm going to double click on the title and change the name to Sky Adjustment. And I'll add an adjustment, you guessed it, another curves adjustment. And so I'll just make an exaggerated adjustment for just the sky. Well, that's all well and good, and obviously I could apply different adjustments. Let's just make a color balance adjustment and shift things a little dramatically so that we can see an obvious change in the image. But notice that my adjustment layer is attached to the layer mask rather is attached to the adjustment layer that I created for the sky, not to the layer group that I created. And so this color balance adjustment is affecting the entire image. What have I done? Well, I didn't create a layer mask for the group. I created a layer mask as part of my adjustment layer. How am I going to fix that? Really easy. This sky layer mask that I think is perfect, or at least I hope is perfect, I'll drag it from my curves adjustment layer and drop it onto my sky adjustment. I'm effectively just moving that layer mask onto the layer group, so now the color balance adjustment is also only affecting the sky, not the rest of the image. Well, what happens if I want to take that a step further and I want my adjustments, in this case color balance and curves, to only affect the sky? I've already accomplished that. But I also want those adjustments to affect the sky in a gradient fashion. Well, I know that I could add a layer group, I can add a layer mask, I can put a gradient onto that layer mask. You can see that I've accomplished exactly that. But it's also accomplishing absolutely nothing, because this gradient layer mask is affecting everything inside the layer group, and there's nothing inside of the layer group. So in the case of the sky adjustments, my sky layer mask is constraining the behavior of these other two adjustments. If I want to get those adjustments to affect the sky in a gradient fashion, I somehow need to get all of this stuff into my layer group. I'll go ahead and rename this gradient just so I know which one is which. I can then drag and drop. I can actually put not just adjustment layers inside of a layer group, I can put a layer group inside of a layer group. So I'll drag and drop that sky adjustment layer group, put it right into that gradient layer group, and now that gradient is affecting the sky and the layer mask for both. So I've got adjustments that only affect the sky and that affect the sky in a gradient fashion. So no matter what I do, my adjustments will never affect the Statue of Liberty in this case. They're only affecting the sky and affecting the sky in a gradient fashion. And so, of course, I can come back to my gradient and refine it. I can come back to my sky versus Statue of Liberty layer mask and clean that up. I know there were a few areas, for example, you can see in the statue was a little bit less than perfect. So I could go clean that up. I can adjust my gradient layer mask if I need to. I can go back to my adjustments and fine tune the result of those adjustments. So I have maximum flexibility. So multiple adjustments, multiple layer masks, and complete flexibility to be able to go back and fine tune things later. Again, just making sure that I save this image. I'll go ahead and choose File, Save As, for example, and as long as I save this image either as a Photoshop document, a large document format if applicable, if it's an especially large image, or as a TIFF image, the tagged image file format, those will all by default include the layers option, and so you can then preserve those layers as part of the image that you've saved, so that later you can always reopen and get back to all of your layers, all of your layer masks, layer groups, etc. Well, thank you guys very much for joining us today. I hope this has been helpful in terms of giving you a better sense of targeted adjustments, selections, layer masks. I promise we will get a webinar scheduled that covers selections in the near future, so stay tuned for that. In the meantime, thanks very much for joining us for today's webinar. I'd be happy to address some questions as well. So let's see, will there be a written tutorial for this webinar, or is this covered in Pixology? There won't be written notes for the webinar. There is a course in the GreyLearning library, so let's just get back to that GreyLearning. I mentioned the link. Let me bring us to that link again. So if you go to timgrey.me/greywebinar, Grey webinar, that will take you directly to this page where you can get that $50 discount off the bundle if you're not already a subscriber. And there are a number of courses included, including a course on targeted adjustments. So right here is the course on targeted adjustments. And so you can see the details, the courses. So all of what I covered today is included in that course, plus some additional topics that we just didn't have time for today. We will have a course on selections, and we'll have a webinar on the topic of selections in the near future. But you can find all of that. And there's some coverage. Off the top of my head, I couldn't tell you exactly which topics were covered in Pixology, but some of this has been covered, and more of it will be covered in the future. But I'd have to look at the list of articles because there's been a lot of articles. In Lightroom, the graduated filter versus Photoshop, which would you prefer? Quite frankly, either way is perfectly fine. My basic rule is I start in Lightroom. Since I use Lightroom to manage my photos, I start in Lightroom as the basis of all of my adjustments, and then anything that I need to do beyond that that is just easier or just more powerful or that Lightroom doesn't offer, then I'll take the image over to Photoshop. And so if it's a real simple gradient adjustment, then I'll typically just start with that inside of Lightroom. It's not until I start needing to get sophisticated. So if you're already a Lightroom user, my personal approach is to get as much done inside of Lightroom as I possibly can and then transition into Photoshop as needed. But of course, there are some photographers out there who are not using Lightroom, and so they're starting off in Adobe Camera Raw for their raw captures, which is literally the exact same set of adjustments as you'll find in the Develop module in Lightroom, and then they're into Photoshop. So same basic concept. Just as you can accomplish a whole lot for your image in Adobe Camera Raw, well, all those same things can be accomplished in Lightroom's Develop module. And then in terms of taking things a little bit further, you can bring it into Photoshop. So again, there is some overlap in terms of that gradient layer mask versus the graduated filter in Lightroom. Part of that's just a matter of personal preference and how you approach your workflow. But otherwise, if you're not a Lightroom user, then naturally you'd start off in Photoshop. If you are a Lightroom user, you might start there. And then a question about Wacom Tablet. Yes, oh my goodness. One of the best tools out there, and I forget to talk about it. I should talk about the Wacom Tablet a lot more. The analogy I always use is imagine signing your signature with your mouse on your computer versus using a pen in your hand. The Wacom Tablet gives you that pen capability. So some photographers use that Wacom Tablet, that stylus, or the pen, in place of a mouse, and they do absolutely everything with the pen. For me personally, that's not my approach because I find that a mouse is just more comfortable for navigating the menu, for example. But when it comes to painting on a layer mask or drawing a selection manually, cleaning up a selection, I find the Wacom tablet to be just absolutely invaluable. So definitely highly recommended. If you're looking for a Christmas present for yourself or an excuse to get something for the new year to kick the new year off right as far as image adjustment, by all means, Wacom tablet is something that I would highly recommend. All right, we've got another question. Lumenzia, no, I have not seen Lumenzia yet, but now I will. So that's a tool for applying luminosity masks, essentially applying targeted adjustments based on luminance. And I've not seen that one, but now I will go check it out. Let's see, the most common area for selecting areas. So for me, the quick selection tool is always my first starting point. Magic wand tool is certainly helpful. I'll use the lasso tool to clean up selections. I'll use the color range selection command in some cases. And there's a variety of other tools, but that's usually where I get my start because usually I find that the quick selection tool gives me a really good starting point. Sometimes Magic Wand, as I mentioned, has some benefits, and then I'll just start using other techniques to clean things up. And I'll produce another webinar in the not too distant future with composite imaging techniques where I start to get a little bit more sophisticated in the use of layer masks. With adjustments, it's usually relatively straightforward. With composite images, things can get a little bit more advanced, more sophisticated. Question about which course. So just as a reminder, we'll get back down to this course, Photoshop Targeted Adjustments, which is in the GreyLearning video training library at greylearning.com. So if you're already a subscriber to GreyLearning, you can just go into My Courses and you'll find this course. You don't need to buy it separately. If you subscribe to the GreyLearning Everything Bundle, as the name implies, that includes everything that I self-publish in the GreyLearning library plus Pixology magazine. So this is the course you'll want to go check out as a good follow-up for today's webinar. There's some few additional topics that we didn't talk about in the webinar. The recording for the webinar will also be available. We'll email that link to you as soon as that video is posted. And then what keys did I use to make the stencil appear? So there's a couple of things there. If we're looking for just seeing the stencil, I can hold the Alt key on Windows or the Option key on Macintosh and click on the thumbnail for that layer mask to see the actual layer mask itself. So I believe that's what the participant was asking about in terms of the question. So Alt or Option key on the keyboard and click on that layer mask so that I can actually see the layer mask. And so, for example, here you can see, obviously, that selection that I created of the sky, a little far from perfect, so I'd want to come in here and clean things up a bit. So obviously some room for improvement on this layer mask, and so being able to view the layer mask itself with that Alt or Option click can be tremendously helpful. All right, well, thank you guys very much for attending. It's been lots of fun. I hope you found it very helpful. Once again, here's that link if you want to get that discount on the GreyLearning Everything Bundle, timgrey.me/greywebinar. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you on the next webinar.